In 1933, Japan left the League and effectively removed the Far East from the system of collective security. In 1934, in violation of international agreements to preserve an open-door policy in China, the Japanese government announced the Amu Doctrine, a warning to other powers to regard China as Japan's sphere of influence and to abandon trade with the Chinese and the provision of technical aid to them. There is no doubt the Japanese leaders, spurred on at home by the military, were encouraged to go further after 1932 than they might otherwise have done because of the weak response from the major powers. China again appealed to the League of Nations after the Marco Polo Bridge incident and the bombing of Shanghai. The League condemned Japan for breaking the Nine-Power Treaty of 1922, but in reality, it could not take practical action to help China. In any case, Britain and France were now preoccupied by events in Europe. Britain repeatedly asked the United States for joint diplomatic pressure on Tokyo, but to no avail. In November 1937, the Nine-Power Treaty Conference convened for the last time in Brussels. It condemned the actions of Japan and urged that hostilities be suspended, but it produced no measures to stop Japanese aggression. Chiang Kai-shek's insistence on fighting the communists rather than the Japanese lost him support even within his own party. In 1933, he had to suppress an uprising among his troops who were protesting at his failure to stand up to the Japanese. There were also demonstrations in Beijing over his Japanese policy, the most serious of which was in 1935. Then in December 1936, while in the middle of a campaign against the communists, Chiang was kidnapped by troops acting under the orders of General Zhang Shiliang, the Manchurian warlord and son of Zhang Jiaolin. Zhang had been placed in charge of the anti-communist campaign, but like other northern commanders, felt that Chiang should be focusing on the Japanese and not the communists. The leaders of the CCP became involved in the negotiation over Chiang's release, and the prominent communist Zhao Enlai flew to Xi'an to negotiate a joint alliance against the Japanese. Although Chiang did not sign a formal agreement, he changed his priority of attacking the communists first before the Japanese. A second united front was formed between the Nationalist Party and the Communist Party. The Civil War was suspended, and instead there was to be a war of national resistance. Following Japan's full-scale invasion of China after the Marco Polo Bridge incident, Chiang Kai-shek announced that the limits of endurance had been reached and that if we allow 1 inch more of our territory to be lost, we shall be guilty of an unpardonable crime against our race. A national conference was held in which both communists and nationalists attended. Mao declared a policy of total resistance by the whole nation. Despite Chiang Kai-shek's apparent new approach to the Japanese following the establishment of the Second United Front, the war went badly for the Chinese. By 1938, Beijing, Shanghai, Yangzhou, and Nanjing had all fallen to the Japanese, and the GMD government had to withdraw their capital to Chongqing. The escalation of the war caused by the Chinese United Front drew the Japanese into a conflict that they did not want and for which they did not have the resources. By 1940, Japan had committed over 750,000 ground troops to the struggle, and despite the lack of any international opposition, the Japanese could not quickly win the war. They were forced to try to consolidate their position by adopting a policy of living off the land with the help of puppet governments. The most important of these was led by Wang Jingwei, who was a former GMD colleague and rival of Chiang Kai-shek. Believing that China could never win against the Japanese, Wang agreed in 1940 to become the head of the new government of China. This regime was recognized by Manchukuo and the three Axis powers, but not by any other Western powers. Thus, by 1938, China was divided into 3 main areas: the nationalist China based in Chongqing, Communist China based in Shanghai, and Japanese-occupied China in the east and north. Despite the united front, tensions between the nationalists and the communists remained high, and there was a deterioration of relations in 1941 when Chiang Kai-shek attacked the communists. However, with the attack on Pearl Harbor and the declaration of war by the U.S. against Japan, Chiang realized that Japan would ultimately be defeated. What had been essentially a Sino-Japanese conflict now became part of the Second World War and the global struggle against aggression and totalitarianism. The U.S.'s main foreign policy concern in the 1930s was to stay out of international crises and to pursue its own interests. In other words, isolationism. After the First World War, many in the United States felt that they did not want to get dragged again into disputes which did not directly affect them. The Wall Street crash of 1929 and the ensuing Great Depression only served to reinforce the United States' concentration on its own issues. The response of the United States government was to issue a non-recognition doctrine, also called the Stimson Doctrine after the Secretary of State, Henry Stimson, on January 7, 1932, in which the United States declared it would not recognize any agreement that violated China's territorial or administrative integrity or that went against the open door policy or the Kellogg-Briand Pact. This non-recognition doctrine allowed Hoover to uphold the international law but also to avoid committing to economic sanctions. When Roosevelt was inaugurated as president in March 1933, he continued with the same limited response to Japan. His attention was focused on solving the economic crisis through his New Deal policies, and outside of the United States, Hitler's policies took most of the U.S.'s attention. Meanwhile, the United States continued to export strategic materials to Japan throughout the 1930s. Although the United States was concerned by Japan's actions, which were a violation of Chinese territorial integrity, and also the open door policy, which had been advocated by President Hoover and FDR, the U.S. took minimal action. U.S. interests and security were not directly threatened by the Manchurian incident, and the focus of the administration was on the economic crisis. In any case, the United States lacked a credible naval force in the Pacific, as Congress had refused funds to bring naval strength up to the Washington Treaty and the London Treaty limits. As with Britain, there were other self-interests for the United States to take into account. The U.S. had trade and investment interests in Japan, which it did not want to jeopardize. Indeed, the U.S. had far more important economic ties with Japan than with the much larger Chinese Republic. The hesitant approach of the United States continued after 1937, despite the fact that Japan's military and economic actions were now becoming a threat to the United States. Japan's ambitious naval building program, launched in 1936, upset the balance of power in the Western Pacific. In addition, the economic penetration into North and Central China following their military invasion threatened U.S. interests in those regions and the whole concept of the open door policy. Roosevelt had some sympathy with China's position, as did the U.S. media. Roosevelt, along with other prominent Americans, gave financial aid. However, none of this translated into political intervention. Indeed, between July and November 1937, the United States rejected 10 British appeals for participation in a joint offer of mediation in the Sino-Japanese conflict and to make a show of naval strength. Roosevelt's actions were in any case limited by several laws called Neutrality Acts, which enforced the U.S.'s isolationist stance by preventing U.S. involvement in conflicts that did not specifically involve the United States. A potential crisis which did actually involve U.S. interests and so could have led to more direct U.S. intervention developed when a U.S. gunboat, the Panay, which was escorting 3 small oil tankers on the Yangtze River, was bombed and sunk by a Japanese aircraft on the 12th of December 1937. However, when the Japanese quickly apologized and offered compensation, many Americans were relieved that a conflict had been avoided. Public opinion in 1937 was overwhelmingly in favor of isolation, with 7 out of 10 Americans in favor of a withdrawal of U.S. citizens from China in order to avoid the possibility of a confrontation with Japan. The U.S. sent representatives to the Brussels Conference in 1937, but showed itself unwilling to go beyond verbal condemnation against Japan. In one speech in 1937, Roosevelt seemed to promise more than this when he called for a quarantine on aggressors to put a stop to the world of disorder. This quarantine speech seemed to indicate a willingness to impose sanctions against Japan. However, if this was his intention, Roosevelt had to quickly back down in the face of public outcry from isolationists. In fact, not only did the United States not impose economic sanctions, its trade with Japan until 1939 played a key role in supporting Japan's war effort against China. The U.S. brought large quantities of Japanese silk and was a major supplier of oil, scrap iron, and automobile parts. It also met nearly 40% of Japan's total needs for metals, cotton, and wood pulp. During 1938, the United States began to carry out a more aggressive policy towards Japan. Roosevelt did not share the sentiments of isolationists. Thus, in 1938, using presidential powers, Roosevelt chose not to apply the Neutrality Acts to China and to give more active support to the nationalists, starting with a loan of $25 million. Why did America start to resist Japanese expansion? The announcement by Japan that it wished to create a new order in East Asia was the turning point. In addition, there was growing concern in the United States that Chiang Kai-shek might respond to overtures from Japan to join with them in this new order. This would put Japan in an invincible position. Another factor was the possibility that if the United States did not give enough aid to Chiang Kai-shek, the Soviets might increase their support for the nationalists, thus further increasing their influence in China. U.S. public opinion also began to swing in favor of Roosevelt's campaign to end the neutrality laws. The international context was key for changing U.S. attitudes. The German victories in the spring and summer of 1940 had encouraged the Japanese in their expansionist policies for fear of missing the bus. In September 1940, Japan entered into the Tripartite Pact with the European fascist powers of Germany and Italy. This stated that if Japan, Germany, or Italy was attacked by any third power, not then engaged in the European War or the China War, the other two Axis powers would aid the victim of the attack. This convinced many Americans that the war in Europe... Okay, god damn it. As historian Kenneth Pyle states, American reaction to the Tripartite Pact was unexpectedly strong. In January 1939, a moral embargo was placed on planes and aviation parts, and in February 1939, credit to Japan was stopped. In July of the same year, a long-standing trade agreement was suspended. A year later, a partial trade embargo on aviation and motor fuel and high-grade melting scrap was put in place. Throughout 1940 and 1941, as Japan advanced, the U.S. gave millions of dollars of aid to China. Following the temporary closure of the Burma Road supply route to China in October 1941, the U.S. agreed to even more loans to China, and by the summer of 1941, they were sending fighter planes. Simultaneously, the United States also put economic pressure on Japan. In July 1941, when Japan moved south rather than moving north to attack the Soviets, the U.S. responded by freezing all Japanese assets. It then imposed a trade embargo in November, which included oil. Britain and the Netherlands also imposed a total trade embargo. As Japan was totally dependent on imported oil from the United States, this created a crisis for the Japanese government, who now believed that the Western powers were attempting to encircle Japan and destroy its rightful place in the world. If its oil reserves ran out, Japan would be unable to continue the war in China. Japan could not risk this happening. There followed negotiations and a diplomatic mission to the United States. However, agreement stalled over the fact that the United States insisted that Japan withdraw from China. Japan may have agreed to withdraw from southern Indochina, but could not agree to removing its forces from China, as this would be unacceptable to the military and the Japanese people. In order to get the resources they needed, the Japanese decided that a war of conquest was necessary. The attack on Pearl Harbor united the American people for war against Japan. Congress agreed to Roosevelt's request for a declaration of war on December 8, 1941, with only one dissenting vote. This was wonderful news for Churchill, who confidently remarked, "Hitler's fate was sealed. Mussolini's fate was sealed. As for the Japanese, they would be ground to powder. All the rest was merely the application of overwhelming force."